The ballroom glittered with 100 candles, their light dancing across silk gowns and polished floors, but Charlotte Ashford, the new Duchess of Calder, felt entirely invisible. She stood near the towering marble pillars, her champagne-colored gown suddenly feeling like a borrowed costume. Around her, the whispers rustled like dry leaves. They were not whispers of admiration. They were murmurs of pity, sharp little sounds that sliced through the music and the laughter. 6 months married, and he never looks at her. They say he only did it to save her family from ruin. A business arrangement, nothing more. Look at him now, he cannot even pretend. Charlotte's gaze drifted across the room, drawn by an invisible thread of pain to where her husband stood. Alexander St. Clair, the Duke of Calder, was impossibly handsome in his dark evening coat, his features carved from stone, his posture radiating the cold authority that made men bow and women hope. And at this moment, he was leaning ever so slightly toward the beautiful Lady Margaret Barlow, a widow with raven hair and a knowing smile. He was not smiling, he rarely did, but his attention was fixed on her with an intensity he had never once directed at his own wife. Charlotte's gloved fingers tightened around her crystal glass. She had married him with a heart full of hope, full of a secret she had guarded since childhood. She had believed, foolishly and completely, that destiny had brought them together. That memory of a long-ago summer fair, when a lost little girl had been found by a boy with kind blue eyes who had given her a pressed bluebell and promised, "I will always find you," had fueled every dream. When she had seen his face on the day their engagement was announced, her heart had nearly stopped. It was him, the boy, her boy. But Alexander St. Clair had looked at her then as he looked at her now, as if she were a piece of furniture, an obligation, a signature on a contract that saved her father from debtor's prison and gave the Duke a suitable, if unremarkable, bride. There had been no flicker of recognition in those cold blue depths. Not then, and not once in all the months that followed. The laughter of Lady Margaret floated across the room, and Charlotte's chest tightened until it became difficult to breathe. She set down her glass with a soft clink that only she could hear and moved quietly toward the terrace doors. No one stopped her. No one noticed. The night air was cool against her flushed cheeks. She leaned against the stone balustrade and stared at the stars scattered across the black sky. She had spent every day of her marriage trying to reach him. Gentle questions over breakfast that were met with clipped answers. Books left open to passages she thought he might enjoy, never acknowledged. A careful inquiry about the gardens which she loved and he never visited. Nothing had worked. She was a ghost in a grand house, and the only thing that had kept her alive was the memory of that pressed bluebell, safely hidden in her jewelry box, and the hope that one day, the boy who had promised to find her would finally remember. That hope had begun to feel like a wound that refused to heal. A soft step behind her made her turn. There he was, Alexander Calder, her husband, standing in the doorway with the candlelight framing his dark silhouette. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he had come looking for her, but his expression was one of mild irritation. "You left the ballroom," he said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "It is expected that the Duchess of Calder remain present. It reflects poorly on this house when you wander off alone." Charlotte's heart, which had dared to lift, fell sharply. "Forgive me," she said quietly. "I needed air. I was feeling unwell." He studied her for a moment, and she held her breath, hopping for a flicker of concern. Instead, he gave a short nod. "See that you return shortly. Lady Margaret was inquiring about the new conservatory. I have no time to discuss horticulture, but perhaps you can entertain her." The cruelty was unintentional, she realized. He simply did not see her as a woman who could be wounded. She was a function, a title. Charlotte pressed her lips together and inclined her head, the gesture of a duchess, perfect and empty. "Of course, Your Grace." He turned and walked back inside without another word. And in that moment, something inside Charlotte Ashford cracked cleanly in two. The hope she had cradled so carefully began to bleed away. She stood alone under the stars, wrapped in silk and humiliation, and made a silent decision. She would stop. She would stop hopping, stop reaching, stop waiting for a memory that would never return. She would become the Duchess he wanted, silent, dutiful, invisible. And she would bury her love so deep that even she could no longer feel it. The following morning, Charlotte rose early. The immense bedchamber she occupied alone was filled with pale light. Her maid, Lily, helped her into a simple gown of dove gray, and she went downstairs to the breakfast room. The Duke was already there, reading his correspondence, his coffee cooling beside him. He did not look up when she entered. She took her usual seat at the far end of the long mahogany table, the distance between them a chasm. Usually she would have offered a quiet greeting, a gentle attempt at conversation. Today she simply lifted the teapot and poured for herself. The silence stretched, heavy and undisturbed. Alexander turned a page. The clock on the mantel ticked. Charlotte ate a few bites of toast, her movements calm and unhurried. When she was finished, she rose. "I shall be in the West Garden this morning," she said, her voice even. "I am cataloging the wildflowers for my botanical illustrations." The Duke glanced up, his expression unreadable. Very well. There was no question about what she drew, no curiosity about her passion. Charlotte had expected none. She left the room, and as she walked through the corridor, she realized that for the first time the ache in her chest was not a sharp stab but a dull, distant throb. She was already learning to let go. Over the following weeks, the household at Calderstone Manor adjusted to a new rhythm. Charlotte was never unkind, never sullen. She fulfilled her duties with quiet grace. She managed the household accounts, visited tenants, and attended the parish church. But the light in her eyes, the tentative warmth she had once directed at her husband, had vanished. She no longer lingered in doorways hopping for his attention. She no longer left notes on his desk. When they dined together, the silence was not tense. It was simply empty. The Duke noticed. Not consciously at first, but a vague sense of something missing began to tug at the edges of his awareness. He found himself glancing toward the garden window more often, catching glimpses of her bent over a sketchbook. Her honey-brown hair escaping its pins, she looked peaceful, she looked absent. It unsettled him, though he could not name why. One afternoon he encountered her in the library. She was perched on a ladder, reaching for a volume on medicinal plants. He paused in the doorway, struck by the quiet concentration on her face. She had never before entered this room, which he considered his private sanctuary. Her presence there felt like an intrusion, yet also strangely natural. "May I assist you?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. Charlotte looked down, her gray eyes meeting his without flinching. "No, thank you, I have what I need." She descended carefully, the book tucked under her arm, and walked past him with a polite nod. There was no hesitance, no hope that he might start a conversation. She simply left. Alexander stood rooted to the spot, a peculiar irritation rising in his chest. He was the Duke of Calder. People did not simply walk away from him, least of all his own wife, who had once followed him with her gaze like a sunflower seeking the sun. But that wife was gone. The true shift came with the arrival of Sir Henry Thorne. He was a baronet of modest means, a respected botanist with kind eyes and an easy smile. He had corresponded with Charlotte about the native flora of the region, and when he called at Calderstone Manor to see her collection of illustrations, she welcomed him warmly. The Duke, passing by the drawing-room, heard a sound that stopped him dead. Charlotte was laughing. It was not a polite, measured laugh. It was genuine, bright, and utterly unfamiliar. Alexander moved closer to the open door, his jaw tightening. Inside, Sir Henry was bent over a large sketchbook, pointing at something, his shoulder nearly brushing Charlotte. She was smiling, her cheeks faintly flushed, her whole demeanor alive in a way Alexander had never witnessed. "The detailing on this bluebell is exquisite, Your Grace," Sir Henry was saying, his tone full of admiration. "You have captured the delicate veining perfectly. It reminds me of the rare specimens in the Northumberland meadows." Charlotte's voice was warm. You are too kind, Sir Henry. It is my favorite flower. They grow wild near the old bridge. Then we must organize a small expedition, Sir Henry said. I would be honored to accompany you and study them in situ. The Duke entered the room, his footsteps deliberate. Both Charlotte and Sir Henry looked up. Charlotte's smile did not fade, but it cooled several degrees, as if a cloud had passed over the sun. Your Grace, she said, Sir Henry has been most complimentary about the illustrations. Sir Henry bowed. Your wife's talent is remarkable, Your Grace. You must be very proud. Alexander's gaze flickered to Charlotte, who was watching him with a mild, questioning expression. He realized with a start that he had no idea what to say. He had never praised her work. He had never even looked at it. Indeed, he managed, the words stiff and hollow. I trust you will not tire the Duchess with too much scholarly talk. On the contrary, Charlotte said smoothly, I find it invigorating. Now, if you will excuse us, Sir Henry was about to explain the pollination patterns of the evening primrose. She turned back to the baronet, her attention closing the Duke out as effectively as a door slamming shut. Alexander felt a hot, unfamiliar emotion surge through him. He identified it a moment later. Jealousy. He, who had never wanted for anything, was being replaced by a man who talked about flowers. The realization was so absurd and so painful that he left the room without another word. That evening, Alexander found himself brooding in his study. The decanter of brandy sat untouched. His mind replayed the image of Charlotte's face illuminated by laughter, laughter meant for another man. He had thought her content in her quietness. He had assumed that her withdrawal was simply an acceptance of their arrangement. But she was not withdrawing from life. She was withdrawing only from him. With others, she was still capable of joy. The thought cut deeper than he could have imagined. A soft knock interrupted his turmoil. It was Mrs. Doyle, the housekeeper, a woman who had known him since childhood. Your Grace, I have the monthly reports from St. Anne's home. The Duchess usually reviews them, but she retired early with a headache. Alexander frowned. St. Anne's home. The orphanage in Calder Bridge, Your Grace. Her Grace has been visiting every week for the past 2 months. She has been funding the new infirmary from her own allowance, and she teaches the children botany. The matron speaks of her with great affection. Another revelation. His wife, the invisible Duchess, had been quietly pouring her heart into the village, and he had known nothing about it. He took the papers from Mrs. Doyle, a heavy weight settling in his stomach. Thank you, that will be all. Alone once more, Alexander stared at the ledger entries written in Charlotte's neat hand. Purchases of blankets, medicines, school supplies. Small sums that added up to a portrait of a woman he did not know. A woman of compassion and quiet strength, and he had treated her like a shadow. The next morning he sought her out. She was in the conservatory, a room he had built long ago for his mother but had neglected for years. Charlotte had transformed it. Potted plants lined the shelves, and a long table was covered with sketches and pressed flowers. She was watering a small fern, her movements gentle, when she sensed his presence and turned. Good morning, she said politely, setting down the watering can. Charlotte, he began, his voice rough, I was unaware of your work at the orphanage. You should have informed me. Her expression remained serene. I did not think it would interest you, Your Grace. It is a small endeavor. It is not small, he said, stepping closer. You are using your own funds. That is unnecessary. I will provide whatever is needed. She tilted her head slightly, studying him as if he were a curious specimen. That is generous, but I prefer to manage it myself. It gives me purpose. The words were not accusatory, but they landed like a blow. Purpose. Something he had not given her. Something she had found entirely without him. Charlotte, he started, but he had no words to follow. What could he say? That he was sorry, that he had been a fool. The admission stuck in his throat, tangled with pride and a dawning, terrifying sense of loss. She waited, her gaze steady and patient. When he said nothing, she gave a small, almost sad smile. If there is nothing else, I have promised to visit the children this afternoon. Sir Henry is bringing botanical prints for them." And there it was again, Sir Henry. The name scraped against his nerves like a file. "I will accompany you," he heard himself say. Her eyes widened slightly. The first genuine surprise he had seen from her in weeks. "You, to the orphanage? Is that so astonishing?" She considered him for a moment. "Frankly, yes." The ride to the village was silent, the carriage carrying them through the green summer lanes. Charlotte looked out the window, her gloved hands folded in her lap. Alexander watched her profile, the delicate line of her jaw, the way the sunlight caught the gold in her hair. He had been blind. She was beautiful, not in the bold way of Lady Margaret, but with a quiet, enduring loveliness that invited a man to linger. And he had never lingered. At St. Anne's home, the children flocked to Charlotte. They called her the Flower Lady and clamored to show her the seedlings they had planted. She knelt in the dirt without hesitation, her fine gown gathering dust, and helped a small boy pat the earth around a daisy. Alexander stood apart, an imposing figure in his tailored coat, utterly out of place. Sir Henry was already there, laughing with the children, his easy charm a stark contrast to the Duke's stiffness. Charlotte rose and accepted a stack of prints from the baronet, their fingers brushing. Alexander's hands clenched at his sides. He watched his wife distribute the prints, explaining the names of each flower with a patience that made his throat ache. This was the woman he had married, this gentle, intelligent, loving soul, and he had let her slip through his fingers while he chased shadows of duty and pride. Later, as they prepared to leave, a sudden summer storm swept in. The sky darkened and rain lashed against the windows of the orphanage. The matron urged them to wait until it passed, but Charlotte glanced at the Duke and then at Sir Henry. "I should return to the manor. There are arrangements to be made for the tenants if the storm worsens." Alexander stepped forward. "We will go now, the carriage is sturdy." He looked pointedly at Sir Henry. "Sir Henry, I trust you can find your own way back." The baronet's smile did not waver, though his eyes sharpened. "Of course, your grace, I would not dream of imposing." He turned to Charlotte and lifted her hand briefly, pressing a light kiss to her glove. "Until our next expedition, Duchess." The Duke's expression could have carved stone. Charlotte withdrew her hand and moved to the carriage without a backward glance. The journey home was tense, the rain drumming a fierce rhythm on the roof. Charlotte sat opposite him, her face pale in the dim light. Neither spoke. That night, Charlotte's slight headache from the previous day returned with a vengeance. By midnight, she was burning with fever. The chill from the damp carriage and the hours spent in the drafty orphanage had done their work. Lily rushed to summon the Duke, and Alexander, still fully dressed in his study, felt his blood run cold when he heard the words, "The Duchess is gravely ill." He strode to her bedchamber, a room he had not entered since their wedding night. Charlotte lay amidst the rumpled sheets, her cheeks flushed scarlet, her breathing shallow. The local physician was already there, his expression grim. "A dangerous fever, your grace. She must be watched closely. Her strength is fragile." Fragile? The word was a physical blow. Alexander dismissed the physician and pulled a chair to her bedside. He took her hot, limp hand in his heart pounding with a fear he had not known he possessed. She looked so small, so breakable. This was not the invisible Duchess. This was Charlotte, his Charlotte, and the thought of losing her was an abyss opening beneath him. He did not leave her side. Days and nights blurred together. He held her hand, bathed her forehead with cool cloths, and spoke to her in low, desperate murmurs. He did not recognize his own voice, stripped of all its pride, begging her to stay. The household moved in hushed whispers, but the Duke was deaf to them. He existed only in the space between Charlotte's labored breaths. On the third night, when the fever finally broke, Alexander was hollowed out and trembling. He had been searching through her small writing desk for a ribbon to tie back her damp hair when his fingers brushed a velvet box hidden beneath a stack of letters. He opened it, and the world tilted. Inside, resting on a bed of faded silk, was a pressed bluebell. It was old, its color bleached to a pale violet, its petals paper-thin. Nestled beside it was a scrap of paper, yellowed with age, written in a childish scrawl. "For the girl with the golden hair, I will find you again, always." Alexander stared at the flower, his mind reeling. A long-forgotten memory surfaced, foggy and distant. A summer fair, a lost child crying by the mill pond. He had been a boy of 12, impatient to leave, but his mother had knelt beside the little girl and soothed her tears while he, at his mother's urging, had given her the bluebell from his own lapel. He had muttered the promise awkwardly, half embarrassed, and then had been pulled away by his father. He had not thought of it for 20 years. He had not connected that little girl with the woman he married. He had not remembered her face. But Charlotte had remembered. She had kept the flower. She had married him believing he would remember too, believing in a bond that he had shattered with every cold word and careless glance. A strangled sound escaped him, something between a sob and a groan. He clutched the box as if it were a lifeline, and he wept. When Charlotte's eyes finally fluttered open, weak and confused, the first thing she saw was the Duke of Calder kneeling by her bed, his dark hair disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed, clutching a velvet box like a penitent at an altar. She blinked, her mind struggling to piece together the sight. "Alexander," her voice was a thread of sound. He lifted his head, and the raw vulnerability on his face stole her breath. "I remember," he said hoarsely. "Charlotte, I remember the bluebell, I remember the fair. You were the little girl, and I promised I would find you. I did not recognize you. I forgot. God forgive me, I forgot." Tears slid down her temples. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, and now it was here, breaking over her like a wave. She had no strength for anger, only a profound, aching relief that he finally knew. "You were so kind," she whispered. "You were the first person who ever promised to come back for me, and when I saw you again, I thought fate had given you to me." He pressed her fingers to his lips, his shoulders shaking. "I failed you. I have been cold and blind and cruel, and I have done nothing to deserve your hope. But I am begging you, Charlotte, do not leave me. I cannot lose you now. I love you. I think I have loved you for a long time, but I was too proud to see it." She gazed at him, this powerful, distant man broken at her bedside, and the last wall around her heart crumbled. She had tried to stop loving him, but love does not die so easily. It only hides and waits. Her fingers moved weakly, brushing the dampness from his cheek. "I am not leaving," she said softly. "I have been here all along." The days that followed were a slow, careful mending. Charlotte grew stronger, and Alexander remained by her side with a devotion that astonished the household. He read to her, brought her trays of broth, and sat with her in the conservatory, where the bluebells had been specially transplanted under his direction. Sir Henry called once, and the Duke received him with icy politeness and a clear undercurrent of territorial warning. Charlotte merely raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She was learning that Alexander's jealousy, however late, was fiercely genuine, and perhaps she did not mind it entirely. One evening, when she was well enough to walk through the gardens, he led her to a secluded spot near the old bridge. The air was sweet with summer, and wild bluebells carpeted the ground in a haze of blue. He stopped and faced her, taking both her hands. "I have spent months regretting the husband I was," he said, his voice low and earnest. "But I want to be the husband you deserve. I want to be the man who keeps his promise. The boy who gave you that flower meant it, even if he forgot. I will spend the rest of my life remembering every detail, every smile, every moment." Charlotte looked up at him, her gray eyes luminous. "I do not need you to be perfect, Alexander. I only needed you to see me, and now you do." He cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I see you, Charlotte. You are my home." When he kissed her, it was not the dutiful brush of a formal husband. It was a confession, a vow, and a new beginning all at once. The bluebells swayed around them, and for the first time in a very long while, Charlotte Ashford, Duchess of Calder, felt the quiet, steady pulse of a love that had been lost and found and finally fully returned. The healing took time, but it was a journey they made together. The orphanage flourished under their joint patronage. The conservatory became a sanctuary where Alexander would often find his wife, sketchbook in hand, and he would sit beside her, asking questions, learning the language of petals and leaves. The whispers in ballrooms changed, too. Now when they entered a room, the Duke's hand rested protectively at the small of his wife's back, his gaze constantly seeking hers. And the Duchess, once invisible, stood at the center of his attention, no longer a ghost, but the very heart of Calderstone Manor. Years later, when their own children ran through the gardens, chasing butterflies and gathering bluebells, Alexander would sometimes find the small velvet box in her dressing room. He would open it and look at the fragile pressed flower, a token of a promise made by a boy and kept by a man who had finally learned to love. And each time, he would place it back with a silent prayer of gratitude for the woman who had waited and for the grace that had brought her back to him when he had all but lost her forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching and see you in the next amazing story.